Good morning, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Brian Katoulis. I'm the Vice President of Policy here at the Middle East Institute. It's a pleasure to invite all of you to our panel on Saudi-Iranian Rapprochement, a diplomatic coup or a temporary respite. We here at the Middle East Institute are committed to our mission as a .edu to offer balanced and clinical analysis on a range of issues related to the Middle East and U.S. policy in the Middle East. And that's why I'm particularly pleased to introduce and moderate this panel with a distinguished set of experts who I'll introduce shortly. On March 10th, the world was surprised by the news that China had brokered a deal to de-escalate and reopen up diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And what happened for a few days in the media, and at least in policy circles here in Washington, D.C., is what often happens on Middle East policy issues. We had a plethora of quick hit opinion analyses offering different views from many different angles. It often, to me, looks like a Rorschach test or an ink blot test that people quite often project their own analyses without sort of getting the full detail of what's happening in a deal like this. What we're going to do today, nearly more than 2 weeks later, is after we've taken a deep breath, take a look at this deal, what it means for China's approach to the Middle East, what it means for the region itself, how various leaders in the region and the people as well, let's not forget the people of Iran and Saudi Arabia and across the region, are absorbing this, and then also try to also answer the question of what does this mean for U.S. policy and the policy of other countries in the broader Middle East. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panel first, and then I'll kick it off with a question to each of the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion. You'll have an opportunity through the chat to join our conversation with your questions, your points, and we'll try to weave them in the 60 minutes that we have. First up, we'll have Ambassador Jerry Feierstein, who is the Distinguished Senior Fellow, former U.S. Ambassador to Yemen, retired Foreign Service, knows the region quite well. I've traveled that region with him quite regularly and frequently in the last year or so, and we'll hear from him first, followed by my other colleague and also friend, Rhonda Slim, who I've known for more than 30 years, I think. Rhonda runs MEI's Track 2 programs, which if you look at some of the reports that she's put out with colleagues, is a program that brings different voices together from across the region to try to actually do the sort of thing that we hope this agreement that China brokered does, is de-escalate conflict and open up new understandings between peoples of the region. Third will be Alex Vitanka, my friend and colleague who runs our Iran program here at the Middle East Institute, and I'll ask Alex a question or two about how Iran has engaged in this deal and why its leadership did and how the people are responding. And then last but not least, we're really honored to have our friend Dr. Sanam Vakil, who's the Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. And she'll also offer her strategic analysis on what this deal means and help us all look into our collective crystal balls and try to predict what's going to happen next. So first, let me turn to you, Jerry, with just a basic question. And I know in December, you had a terrific program, which you can find, everybody can find on MEI's website, mei.edu, examining China's role in the Middle East. This was done right after President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia. So I thought maybe you could kick us off with the broker of this deal, China, and how you see it's positioning itself in the region writ large, and then what is the importance of this deal in that context? Over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and to have this conversation. And I would start off by making what I think is the most important point, and that is that the significance of this deal, what this deal actually accomplishes, is unclear at this point. We don't know beyond the fact that the two sides have agreed to return their ambassadors to their respective capitals, what it actually accomplishes. Of course, the return of the ambassadors has been an Iranian priority since the two sides actually started having some conversations quietly a few years ago that subsequently was brokered or facilitated by the Iraqis, after that by the Omanis. And so this has been a conversation that's been going on. And in fact, the basic aspects of the agreement were there for the parties to pick up throughout this entire time. And so, from that perspective, I would say that, again, one shouldn't exaggerate what the Chinese role has been in this. It's not as if the Chinese were really deeply engaged in bringing the two sides together, rolling up their sleeves and really exercising a strong mediation role. This was an agreement that was available to the two parties and was more or less dropped into China's lap because the two sides, the Iranians and the Saudis in particular, felt the need to find a way forward. The Iranians, for their own reason, and I think we'll hear more about that from Alex in a few minutes, but the Iranians feeling pressure both internationally and domestically, and the Saudis concerned about the direction that events were going, particularly following the failure, or at least the stalemate in the Iran nuclear talks in Vienna, plus the rise of a hardline government in Israel, made the Saudis concerned that, in fact, the potential for a conflict in the region was rising, and that was something that they clearly have wanted to avoid for a long time now, particularly because they're uncertain about the strength of the U.S. security umbrella. And both sides would see reason to want to reward the Chinese. China is the number one trading partner for both. They have been good and impartial friends. And for the Saudis, it's an opportunity for the Saudis to reinforce a message that we have heard again for several years now, which is that Saudi Arabia intends to balance among its three major international partners, the United States, China, and Russia. So at the same time that we're seeing the Chinese mediating or facilitating an agreement with Iran, we hear reports that Russia is doing the same between Riyadh and Damascus. As a way to assuage any hurt feelings in Washington, they dropped $37 billion on Boeing aircraft, as well as releasing a Saudi American who had been detained in Saudi Arabia. But the question that you asked was, how does this affect China's perspective or China's role? It's not clear that the Chinese really see this. I think that to a certain extent they enjoy the idea that they have put a thumb into Joe Biden's eye, that somehow or other this has raised the role of the Chinese. But China isn't about to pick up any security requirements for the same reason that the U.S. couldn't have brokered an Iran-Saudi deal. The Chinese are in no position to become a security guarantor for the GCC when their relationship with Iran is equally important to them. And so they're limited in what they can do to try to build on this. And the other point that I would make is that even from a Chinese perspective, it's not clear that this deal is going to advance their interests in the region. If, for example, as many have speculated, the idea is that somehow Iran would help facilitate an agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis to end Saudi engagement in Yemen, that is something that actually can lead to a deterioration of conditions inside of Yemen. And we can talk about this later if you want, in ways that are destabilizing for the region and not particularly in China's interests. In the same way, if the agreement means that the U.S. exercises less leverage on Iran to try to bring it back into compliance with the JCPOA or some variation of the JCPOA, that also presumably is not in China's interest as one of the parties to the nuclear agreement. So how this is going to play out is very unclear. And let me just reiterate that the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned, is that substantively we don't know what the agreement is going to mean going forward. It's still unproven. The fundamental issues between Iran and Saudi Arabia are unresolved on the basis of this agreement. And the importance of the Chinese role is also exaggerated. And we should keep our powder dry before we draw any assumptions.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. That's a dash of cold water for all those starry-eyed op-eds that talked about a new era of China diplomacy that's going to remake the Middle East and compete with the United States. I welcome the other panelists, if they have a different view from Jerry, to express it. I'm not sure if we'll get that, because that's a good thing. I want to next turn to Rhonda Sliam, who I introduced as a colleague and talked a bit about her Track 2 program. I just have to say, this program does tremendous work that actually brings many different voices together. She's been doing it for years. I think the sort of openings we need to see in the Middle East that de-escalate tensions come from sessions like the ones that Rhonda's been doing for years. And in addition to that, she's just a phenomenal analyst. And Rhonda, you and I have talked about, and the team here at MEI, the countervailing tendencies we've seen in the last year, the trends towards de-escalation on certain fronts and openings between countries that didn't have strong relations before, and also the escalatory trends that are still present in the environment and how complicated that is. Based on the work that you've been doing through the years, and then over the last few months, conversations you've had, how do you assess this China brokered deal to reopen ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia? What do you think are the positive benefits, and then what are some downsides from your perspective?
Thanks, Brian, for this very nice introduction. And it's really an honor to join the virtual podium with the others panelists. Listen, I tend to agree with Jerry, though we don't know in terms of what this deal is, and and the role of the Chinese in this deal making. I think really the deal was thrown, into the laps of the Chinese during Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia for the meetings, or the 3 summits meeting. From what we know from statements that have been issued by the Saudis about the contents of the deal, general statements, it refers to the traditional principles of non-interference in internal affairs, respect for territorial sovereignty, and, implementation of previous agreements between, or revival of previous agreements between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the 1998 and the 2000 agreement. The first time I have heard about this, all of this package of the deal, exactly the way it is it was mentioned in the statement issued by the Saudis government after the deal was inked in Beijing, was September 2021. This was after a series of negotiations between the Saudis and the Iranians in Baghdad. So, to point to Jerry's, remarks, that the deal, the contents of, at least from what we know about them, were already them as early as 2021, at least September 2021. And so the Chinese, basically, choice of China is, of course, it's a plus, it's like not a gift, but I think it's a pragmatic choice. It has good relations with both countries, and both countries are incentivized to boost its role in the region. And so it's a win-win solution for both the two sides to the conflict, as well as for the Chinese as a mediator. Now, how deep this agreement is going forward, how it's going to be implemented, will it be implemented? What are the challenges? I think time will tell. I mean, at least for me, it is if it can create a sustainable respite from the rivalry, the conflict that has existed between these two countries, major countries in the region. I think it's good for the region, it's good for the Saudis, it's good for the Iranians, but it's good for de-escalation in the region. I've always maintained that the golden key to conflict de-escalation in the region is going to be de-escalation on the Saudi-Iranian front. So if this agreement can create this kind of de-escalation, not even, and I agree with Jerry, it's not going to solve the structural issues that divide the two countries. It's not going overnight to overcome the wall of mistrust that divides these two countries. It's going to take a lot of time, if it can be sustained, in order for the two sides to basically, check each other's respect for the commitments they made to the agreements. I mean, there are so many political minefields in this relationship between Saudis and the Iranians that can upend this agreement anytime. And so will they be able to navigate around these minefields? What are the factors that are entering into the political space that can enable them or basically disable them from commit or from respecting some of these commitments? I think time will tell. So it's important to contextualize the contours of this agreement. It's not about heralding a new regional order. It is about creating a pause, hopefully a long-term pause. However, having said that, a pause like this, especially if it's sustained, can create political conditions, the political environments in the region for the countries in the region, GCC, other Arab countries, Iran, Turkey, and maybe Israel, to come together around a new regional security architecture or a new regional order. So in a way, this agreement is a necessary, but not a sufficient prerequisite for, this big discussions around, a new modus vivendi or a new and eventually a new regional order. That's way away. I mean, we are far away from this. Now, why this agreement happened, and as I said, it has been long in the making, and I'm talking here about the perspective from the Gulf perspective, from the Arab perspective, and I think Alex will talk about the Iranian perspective. I think partly some of these factors, war weariness, feelings of overextension from a couple of decades of confrontation and conflict, starting with the Iraq War in 2003, followed by the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011. I think countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran found themselves overextended in the region and to some extent, are exhausted. I mean, there is really a popular exhaustion with war and with conflict. And I think these countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Iran, preceded by the United Arab Emirates, by Qatar, by everybody, I think we're reacting to this popular mood. The second factor, again, it has been talked about in op-ed, but it's whether it's in reality, and I know there are commentators who said it's not in real terms, it's not happening in real terms, or whether it's perception, but politics pretty much is perception, or perception is politics. I mean, the feeling in the region that the US is deprioritizing the region, and as a result, traditional alignment with Washington is no longer, and has been for some time now, at least since 2019, the de facto policy position of many countries, especially in the Gulf. And so, as building on what Jerry said, I think what they have done is this drive, I mean, that has prompted partly this drive for regional diversification in relationships with global powers such as Russia and China. Now, in some of our dialogues, track 2 and conversation, what I also found is the impact of the Ukraine war on the calculi of the region leaders, I think has gone partly into shaping the into driving this agreement also. I think the hardening of global geopolitical fault lines with Russia as a result of Ukraine and or more with China has given the countries in the region, especially GCC, this pause to focus now on their internal regional affairs as I attempt to carefully balance relationship with all sides. Now, add to that the priority focus now, again, partly Ukraine, but it has been now going on for some time, in the region across the board is increasingly going to be on energy, on climate, on economic. And so in this respect, this agreement in a way allows Saudi Arabia to change the nature of the game or of the conflict with Iran. It's no longer as much about having non-state-owned militias that are beholden to you. It's no longer about, necessarily only drones. I think the next arena of competition is going to be economic. It's going to be investment. It's going to be climate. It's going to be public health. And in that game or in that conflict, in that arena, I mean, Saudi Arabia is already way, way, way advanced than Iran. And if it were to play the long game within this arena, I think it definitely will change the nature of the competition and might create, some kind of a pressure on the Iranians because of the demonstration effect of what investment in economics, investment in climate can do in the region. I mean, I'll never forget in the past when the Saudis were interested in investing in Iraq, partly because of Qademi, but also partly because they wanted to show what a prosperous Shia majority country can look like to the Iranians. And now I think with this current government in Iraq, it's not the case, or they are less interested. But I think this is what it is about. This agreement enables Saudi to play the game according to its own rules and changes the nature of the game to its own benefit. And let me conclude by saying something about the nature of conflict, negotiations, and mediation in the region. In some ways, in very small ways, this agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians reminds me, or is similar in some limited ways, to the agreement between Israel and Lebanon on the maritime border. I mean, the scope is way, way different. There, it's much more limited. It's between, the negotiation have been going on for far longer than is the case between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But in other ways, the conflict is the negotiations, or the negotiation are similar in terms of focusing on specific issues that can be done in the short term and that can create a political environment that create opportunities for improving relation in the long term. And so if you look at it, the choice of the mediator in the Lebanese-Israeli case makes perfect sense. Israel has access to both countries, has good relations. The US has good relations with both Israel and Lebanon, has the leverage, and they have to be able to act as guarantor of the agreement. The same thing in the Saudi-Iranian agreement. China has good relations with both countries and has the leverage with both countries to help implementation, assuming that they will do that. So I think we are entering into an era where we are not going to any longer see big agreements, big treaties. We are going to see more issue-focused, agreements that can create pauses, that can help de-escalate tension, and in the interim create opportunities for improving relations.
Great, thanks, Rhonda. Your comments offer a lot more depth and texture from the framework that Jerry set, and maybe a little bit more of a hopeful sign about this being a necessary but insufficient in and of itself for solving the problems of the broader region, and that perhaps with baseball season here in America upon us, that the best we can hope for aren't home runs or grand slams, but basically getting on base and hitting singles, small tactical, pragmatic adjustments. And we'll circle back certainly to some questions I have on U.S. policy, and Jerry mentioned Yemen, but I want to turn next to Alex Vatanka to help us understand Iran's motivation here. The motivation of the regime to enter into this agreement is, as Rhonda just mentioned, there have been successive rounds of talks like this. And as she mentioned, in September of 2021, she heard the contours of this after some meetings that Iraq had convened, and as well Oman. There have been some direct talks. How do you see Iran's leadership and its calculus in all of this? Certainly, it's at the end of a 6-month period where protests have been ongoing against the regime since September of last year. Also, an important period where Iran quite visibly has aligned itself more closely with Iran in providing, with Russia in providing its drones and support to Russia in its war against Ukraine. So paint us a picture, Alex, of Iran's calculus here, and then if there's been any reaction also from the Iranian people and those protesting in the streets to this deal brokered by China.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you all. Before I answer those questions about the calculations of the Iranian leadership and Iranian public reaction, just reacting quickly to two comments or overall takes that Jerry and Randa just provided. I agree pretty much with everything they said. They laid the ground really nicely. I think, we all agree de-escalation in the Middle East is something that anyone should welcome. I mean, it's good news across the board. And I think that's where we are, particularly when it comes to Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two pivotal, in many ways, powers in the region. So that's something to be welcomed. I also want to caution against I agree that China probably didn't make this deal happen. In fact, you can go back and say the Iranians and the Saudis really started seriously talking pretty much within weeks of the Al-Ula agreement in 2021. As soon as the Gulf Arabs started putting their differences aside and looking for a way of perhaps looking at the region differently, the Iranians by April of that year were having talks with the Saudis, which in many ways also means US calculations and decisions towards this region really are oftentimes pivotal factors that shape their calculations back there. So I think that where the Chinese were playing a role, that's something that we can discuss later on. But certainly it's been mentioned that the Chinese have leverage. Clearly they do, economic leverage, and that matters a lot. And I like to link that to the issue of something I think Randa also mentioned just before, the future of the region, the way leaders are seeing it, which is one of economic development, sort of putting the last 20 years of war and zero-sum competition aside, because nobody's really winning, everybody's losing, and that can be true for the future. That has to change. And I think where the Chinese are coming in, and this is a challenge for US policymakers, the Chinese are saying, and this is something you pick up when you read the regional media and the narrative that's coming out. We're not China, that is. We're not just deal makers. We are peacemakers. And the United States doesn't have any plans to bring about peace to the region. And the worst sort of conspiratorial sort of line of argument that you hear is that the United States, in fact, benefits from the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's what the United States wants to see, the region split. This is the sort of narrative that policymakers in Washington need to push back on forcefully. Remind everybody that it's Iran that doesn't want to talk to the United States, right? That's important. It gets forgotten. Why couldn't the United States do this deal and China could? Well, Iran doesn't talk to the United States. And I can tell you that there are Iranians right now who are saying, actually, the fact that China has so much leverage over us isn't necessarily a good thing for Iranian national interest. So that said, very quickly, Brian, in terms of what led to the decision, as I said, this has been in the pipelines for some time. It goes back to the presidency of Hassan Rouhani. You could argue that as soon as the United States put the maximum pressure sanctions regime on Iran, May of 2018, the Iranians were panicking in terms of how to rescue as much of their economy as they could. And one of the things that came out of that panic was looking at their neighborhood differently, which led to what they call the neighborhood policy. So a lot more focus on neighboring states, a major increase in trade with neighboring states, because it's easy to go around the sanctions when you're dealing with immediate neighboring states. And on top of that, they've always considered Saudi Arabia to be a key player in the Iranian opposition, the anti-regime movement, if you will. So certainly the last 6 months or so, with the protests in Iran having picked up, you've seen the Iranian regime admitting, certainly in the realm of the media warfare that Iran and Saudi have always waged one against each other, that Iran was losing. The likes of Iran International, which allegedly is funded by the Saudis, was something the Iranian regime was frankly panicking about, and they wanted the Saudis to stop supporting it. So that's one reason. The domestic pressure was one reason, to peel the Saudis off your will and stop Saudi Arabia bankrolling the way the regime in Tehran sees it, the Iranian opposition. There are other factors to prevent Saudi Arabia from moving closer to Israel. That's always been a factor, certainly since Abraham Accords was born. So I think that was also a reason why the regime felt that it needed to have a different approach to Riyadh. You could also make the argument that, we've heard in recent years that the United States wants to create, if you will, the NATO of the Middle East, this military alliance against Iran. Again, the Iranians wanted to sort of undermine such a project. Now, which other countries more powerful in the Arab world and in the region, if you could take them away from that mission, peel them off from that message, than Saudi Arabia? So one of the things the Iranians are hoping to get is by discouraging the Saudis from going down the path of joining any military alliance against Iran. So that's good news from Iran's perspective. And finally, and this links immediately to the future of this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is, Iran right now is probably and this is a big moment of decision for them. What do? Do they sort of consolidate their regional files, meaning Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen? In the case of Yemen, it's a must for them to do something different on Yemen for this agreement to survive. But I also wonder if the Iranians think that having a different conversation with the Saudis might actually be beneficial to them and their presence in places like Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. So again, I think the last one here, in terms of a bigger dialogue with Saudi Arabia over regional files, is probably less likely, but with the exception of Yemen, which is core to this agreement. But I do overall think that the reaction, certainly in Tehran, to your point about public reaction, I haven't seen anyone criticize the deal. I haven't seen reformist moderates criticizing. The only criticism you hear from the reform moderate camp is this is something we could have done years ago when Rouhani was in power. And the hardline camp, the Revolutionary Guards, Ayatollah Khamenei, and the likes of Ibrahim Raisi would tell us that we're traitors, we shouldn't talk to Saudi Arabia, but once you're in power and you can cut a deal, then that's all great. So there is that politics of it inside of Tehran that's going on. But the bigger issue here is, again, to something that both Jerry and Randa pointed out, can this be sustained? Can this agreement be sustained? We've been here before. We all remember the 1980s, Iran and Saudi Arabia cut diplomatic relations, resumed in the 1990s. It didn't last that long. I mean, it lasted, but it sort of fell apart. So the question right now is, can the regime sort of keep this agreement alive, which I think fundamentally goes back to that point I made at the outset. What does the regime wants to get out of its regional policies? If it's one of economic development and finding formulas for win-win with regional states like Saudi Arabia, then we can say we've entered a new era. And this Islamic Republic is different from the Islamic Republic that passed. This remains to be seen. But if the Islamic Republic thinks, oh, we just got Saudi Arabia on board, let's put the pressure on the Americans, such as, for example, the attack we just saw in Syria, this could be a major miscalculation by the Iranian regime. I think they'll be mistaken thinking the Saudis have made a decision to give up in the United States. I don't see any evidence of that. So I think, Iran right now has to sort of make a decision. Is this a moment of opportunity to prove their credentials that they do want to coexist and bring instability across the board? Or to see this as a weakness on this part of the United States and double down on the so-called axis of resistance and push the United States and partners as much as they can in the region? Again, it remains to be seen, but let me stop there, Brian.
Great, thanks, Alex. And before I turn to Sanam, thanks for your patience, Sanam. Just two quick things. First, for those of you who've joined online and want to join in the conversation, please use the Q&A function to jump in with some of your questions or comments. The water's warm, don't be bashful. We'd love to thread through some of your comments or questions here. Second, Sanam, before I turn to you, I was thinking about my own involvement in a dialogue in Beijing in 2015 about the US-China relationship in the Middle East and happened to be there when the Yemen war broke out, or at least the Saudi Emirati intervention in it. And I turned to a Chinese official at the time and said, what are you going to do about this? And they said, well, we're going to get any of our citizens out if we have any there. Then it's over to you, America, because that's not what we do. We come in with economic tools after conflicts are resolved. And that sort of has always stuck with me 8 years later in terms of the differences of approach between the US and China. Sana, the question to you, and Rhonda covered some of this, but I think it'd be interesting to get your insights, in particular on the other side of the Gulf, from what Alex was just talking about. He focused on Iran. Maybe tell us a bit of your analysis on Saudi Arabia and why it's done this deal, and maybe offer some comments in reaction to what both Jerry and Rhonda and also Alex had to say. Over to you, Sana.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for having me as part of this conversation. The sort of beauty of coming last is you get to repeat what everyone else has already said and using different words. And I think we're all quite like-minded. I'll try to use really different words so I sound like I'm bringing in my own special perspective. But I really very much wholeheartedly share so much of the analysis by Jerry and Rhonda and Alex. I'll try to add some new thoughts, some thinking based on some work and research, and also dialogues that we've held here at Chatham House. I mean, firstly, if I'll start on the China side, I'm also quite cautious in how I see China's involvement in this agreement. It was really sort of low-hanging fruit that the Chinese sort of picked and pushed over the line, and easy win for China effectively. I think that I still see China as very much still a free rider on the US security presence in the region. And you know, while this could foreshadow a shift where, you know, China might be suggesting that it might over time invest a bit more in terms of security management, I don't think that this deal foreshadows that China is going to be the compliance officer, nor does it want to or have the capacity to be the compliance officer between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That's not really how China operates, doesn't get into the weeds and the details. It wants to maintain its sort of balanced approach in the region as an economic actor rather than a security guarantor. It could evolve, or it could step into this space based on, I think, the competition with the United States. But I think that's a much longer time horizon, and you know, perhaps you know, well past a decade or two, hopefully, rather than right now. Additionally, I don't think the region, the MENA region, is in China's first, second, third, or fourth degree priority. You know, it's much more concerned with its close neighborhood, competition with the United States, then it's Central Asia, and you know, maybe then comes the Middle East, and the Middle East is not like an attractive place for China to necessarily invest its limited resources on, also because it's conflict ridden, and it, you know, tends to drag external actors down to the point that they get fatigued. So I think we're still quite far away from China to step in to the US's shoes. And I think actually from Washington's perspective, this should really be seen as a win for Washington. I mean, they've been calling for burden sharing and de-escalation for so long. And I think that this pattern of de-escalation, as both Rhonda and Alex have mentioned, has been underway in the region now since 2019. I mean, the UAE led the approach in response to Iran's maximum resistance strategy in 2019. And since then, we have seen just an unprecedented wave of de-escalation, not just between the UAE and Iran. And of course, now we're talking here about Iran and Saudi Arabia, but I mean, Turkey and Israel, UAE and Turkey, you know, there's outreach going to Assad. There's been the Abraham Accords, Egypt and Turkey. I mean, this is sort of a new way of engagement in the region that again, going back to what Rhonda says, I see as very much driven by conflict fatigue, post-COVID, prioritization on economic resilience, and of course, deeply impacted by continued security concerns with the United States, distraction, geopolitical distraction over Ukraine. So this is an opportunity, I think, for regional states more broadly to manage their own dialogue directly, maybe shifting away from the outsourcing security posture of the past. So I think from the Gulf perspective, and taking it specifically to your question, this is an opportunity. We are seeing a sort of robust Saudi approach to its foreign policy. One where it's clearly engaging not just with its region and its neighborhood in a much more activist and proactive way, but also with China and Russia and the United States. I don't think we should be looking at Riyadh's maneuvering, again, also in zero-sum terms. As Jerry mentioned, they engaged in this outreach to Beijing and also bought Boeing planes in the same week. And I think these are very clear signals that Riyadh remains intent on balancing and bridging and preparing for a longer term period of geopolitical competition. And with its FDI objectives attached to Vision 2030, still quite far away from its goals, and in fact being much lower than they were even when Vision 2030 was announced in 2016, 2017. I think that the priority for the Crown Prince and for the kingdom is to double down on Vision 2030 and build that resilient economy and of course, de-escalation has to be achieved, not just with Iran, but also on its borders with Yemen. And that's going to be a longer term process than what we can expect to be achieved in the next 2-month period. So there's so many complexities here. I just want to add one more point with regards to the Iran angle. I think that for Tehran, the outreach with Saudi Arabia, while underway, and I think that Tehran would have much preferred to have this deal negotiated by the Iraqis or the Omanis rather than the Chinese. I think Iran also doesn't want to have China, peering over, into its domestic politics. Really, for Iran, symbolically, sort of showcases that it's being flexible after the protests, and that flexibility is really important in order to, I think, send messages to its domestic population that, of course, has been protesting for a number of months, that any sort of support that might have been there from Saudi Arabia, any support to Sunni communities protesting in Saudi Arabia, any support to the diaspora that might be a recipient of support from abroad, that is going to be stopping. And I think it shows that Iran's threat perception of outside countries interfering in its domestic politics has gone up. And so it's willing to de-escalate on that frontier in order to reduce the threats that it is currently facing. And they're multiple. And because it clearly underestimated the level of anger and animation in the Iranian diaspora over the protests, and did not anticipate that Europe would also respond to the protests in the way that they have and imposed further sanctions on Iran. It made sense from Tehran's perspective to try to reduce tension in the region so that, perhaps, and I don't know how they'll get there, and I'm not terribly confident that they will get there, but perhaps that kind of flexibility will signal and send messages to other capitals that Tehran is willing to moderate or change its posture. So, it's looking for release valves effectively. So thank you.
That's great, Sanam. Wow. I just want to say, wow, you took through a 360 view of the region and really sort of helped set the framework for the question and answer period in this conversation. And I'm really grateful for it because there's a lot of rich material in there. And I'm also looking at the rich set of questions after I prompted many of you to jump in. And I just have to say yowza to that. Wow. I'm trying to figure out how to use the next 15 minutes or so to group these questions and guide the conversation. I think we may need to expand our seminars in the future beyond 60 minutes because there's a lot of good material here. The one question I wanted to circle back to all of you, and I think it's embedded in many of the questions we have from the audience, but it's a key question I wanted to frame up at the outset, which is what does this actually mean from your perspective for U.S. policy, particularly what the U.S. should be doing differently from its current approach right now? Alex, you briefly mentioned the attacks and the back and forth between U.S. military and Iranian-backed militias, showing that perhaps this agreement definitely doesn't include the U.S. in any sort of meaningful way, and what that might mean in terms of its relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and some of its other partners in the region. Maybe turning back to you, Jerry, what does this mean for U.S. policy in particular? Because you also mentioned, if we want to talk a little bit more about Yemen, what are the opportunities here, to start with the positive, and then what are potential downsides for what you see as the U.S. wanting to get done, and then importantly, what do you think the Biden administration might consider doing differently as a result?
Thanks, Brian. It's a complicated question, and let me just say at the outset that I think the Biden administration responded in the way that the only way that they could respond, because obviously they could not take a position that we didn't welcome something that might reduce tension in the region, and so they've done that. And generally speaking, I mean, we have to keep in mind that indeed, when Joe Biden came into office in January 2021, one of their highest priorities was, in fact, finding ways of reducing tension in the Middle East. They had hoped to do it by re-engaging with Iran through the JCPOA process. That hasn't worked out. So now we have this situation. I think that for the U.S., it gives an opportunity to do something that I think has been there really since the pandemic, and that is to look at how the U.S. can engage. I think that the United States still enjoys advantages, competition advantages in our ability to engage on issues like, the ones that Alex mentioned. I mean, climate, public health, some of the broader economic issues, where the United States is still going to be the premier source of capital for governments that want to promote foreign direct investment. All of these things really position the United States very well to compete successfully if they choose to do it. It does complicate the administration again, as I mentioned, in terms of our desire still to address the Iranian nuclear file. I think that taking Saudi Arabia out of the equation, whether in the short term or the longer term, does mean that we've lost leverage with the Iranians to try to press them into returning to the JCPOA or taking other steps that move them away from their pursuit of the nuclear weapons capability, and in that sense, it complicates our ability to contain the Israelis, frankly. And how are we going to manage if the Iranians use this opening with Saudi Arabia as a way to accelerate their weapons development programs? What does that mean in terms of how the United States is going to manage the Israeli desire to take more aggressive steps to stop that? And I think that's going to be a challenge for the administration going forward. On Yemen, it's a complicated story on Yemen, and let me just try to be very kind of simple about it, simplistic, and that is to say that taking Saudi Arabia out of the equation on Yemen, which has been a Houthi priority for some time now. I mean, we understand that the Saudis, as several of my colleagues have made the point, Saudis are fatigued. They want to get out. Mohammed bin Salman wants to concentrate on Vision 2030 and building his economy and resilience. Understand all that. But the reality is that you've got this conflict on the southern border, which is destabilizing. Taking Saudi Arabia out of that equation, whether it's through this Iran-Saudi deal or whether there is going to be a parallel agreement between the Saudis and the Houthis, in fact, frees the Houthis to double down on their efforts to secure a military victory inside of Yemen. And the result will be that, in fact, the situation inside of Yemen could very well deteriorate as a result of this agreement, unless the Saudis hold firm in saying that there's got to be, as part of this package, there has to be a Yemeni deal. And unfortunately, although the Houthis have allegedly agreed to return to some negotiations after the Eid in May, the reality is that what we've seen in the last few days has actually pointed in a different direction. The Houthis have re-engaged militarily in Ma'rib, which is critical for the future of Yemen. They launched a drone attack trying to assassinate the Yemeni Minister of Defense. They've just held military maneuvers on the Saudi border, and so the Houthis, may see this as a green light for them to return to their initial objective of winning a war in Yemen, winning the civil war. And how the Saudis are going to manage that, I'm afraid, is going to be a real challenge for Mohammed bin Salman. It may not be the end of Saudi engagement that he had hoped for. So let me stop there.
Great. Thanks for that. And I know you have an upcoming seminar on the Yemen war. And as your work has consistently done, you've demonstrated the point that we can't just simply click our heels and chant "end endless wars" to get to a conflict resolution scenario in Yemen that's sustainable. Looking at the clock, and I'm sorry to do this in this way, but I'm going to ask Rhonda next. The central question of what you think this should mean for U.S. policy in the broader Middle East. And then, if I may impose upon you, Rhonda, because I know you've spent a lot of time in Lebanon, you're from Lebanon, there's been several questions in the chat about what this may or may not mean, the Iran-Saudi deal brokered by China, for the deadlock in Lebanese politics. Would love to hear your views, maybe briefly, on that before I turn to Sanam and then Alex.
Yeah. Quickly on the Lebanon front, it's not going to mean much. I mean, the Lebanon political impasse is much a domestic issue driven by leaders with their own domestic calculi. I mean, and Iran has been very reluctant to get involved in domestic politics of Lebanon for a long time. Hezbollah they are pretty confident that Hezbollah will protect their interests, in Lebanon without having to be involved. And Hezbollah has been doing that. The Saudis are not interested anymore in Lebanon since 2015, when the current crown prince and, with the king, decided to cancel that multi-billion-dollar deal, of grant to the LAF. And since then, it's very clear they are no longer interested in Lebanon. And as many Saudi officials said, this is a lost cause for us. Iran would like to have control of Lebanon. Let them be. It's a bankrupt country. They are welcome to it. And so I don't think it's going to impact the political impasse. The political impasse will be solved when the Lebanese leader decide it's no longer in their benefit to continue in this political impasse. And there are a number of factors, local, that will determine that calculus, and that will change that calculus over time. And the Lebanese basically are not, putting pressure. I mean, you need bottom-up pressure on the leadership, and that bottom-up pressure is gone. It's either emigrated, or it is dead, killed, or it is just given up on making any change in the country. Pivoting quickly to the US, I would like to take a different tack. I think this is a positive, what happened. And I think the first reaction is positive that the de-escalation agreement happened. The one area where there is potential for cooperation between US-China in the midst of this strategic competition is going to be the Middle East. I mean, we have a lot of shared interest in the region. And I think, in fact, we should use this as an opportunity to launch maybe a dialogue with the region, with countries in the region, with the Chinese, America, China, and the Middle East, on regional order, on regional architecture, wherever, on areas for investment. But personally, I think there is an opportunity for a US-China dialogue on the Middle East. And it could be a good thing in the midst of this ongoing strategic competition.
Great. Thanks, Rhonda. And next, I want to turn to Sanam. And I know we've mentioned Israel briefly, and I didn't want to get into everything that is happening right now on Israel and inside of Israel just today. But MEI does have on Thursday an interesting webinar with our colleague Nimrod Goren looking at Israel's foreign policy 100 days into this government, if this government actually makes it that long. We'll see. But it should be a really interesting discussion. Sanam, I wanted to turn to you with this question of U.S. policy. And I know you've been doing some thinking and work on the Abraham Accords and what the possibilities of an opening between Israel and Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region might look like. How do you see sort of this agreement, the China brokered deal, impacting, if at all, those dynamics? And maybe tell us a little bit of your work on that front, on the Abraham Accords.
Thank you, Brian. Actually, tomorrow we're launching a paper that examines sort of the larger regional security implications of UAE-Israel relations. And I think while not a perfect fit or a perfect model, I think the Emirati approach that has seen the UAE outreach to Iran while also strategically and economically engaged with Israel is a worthwhile one to compare Saudi Arabia's approach, because it is following suit in engaging with Iran. Its issues are different and obviously much more complex and deeper and harder to manage. But at the same time, we also know that Riyadh has been maintaining sort of back channel negotiations with Israel for quite some time. There's also been some dialoguing and work done to see how the Israeli goals of expanding the accords could reach the kingdom as well. And I think, the Israeli political the foreign minister has been, quite brash and overconfident, maybe saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. I think that I wouldn't again see the Iran-Saudi dynamic as impacting the Israeli-Saudi dynamic, really, because I think that we are again in this whole new region where transactional groupings that assert countries' diversified interests are really being played out in a multifaceted way. And then I think that there are opportunities here for the Biden administration, to go back to your question, to really continue their support of all of these processes, which is currently the Biden strategy, to put rhetorical but also diplomatic support to all of these groupings and see what emerges from them. And at the same time, I think that both the UAE and Saudi Arabia, while outreaching to Israel and engaging with China and Iran, are still very much clinging to their relationship with Washington. So there's clearly more that the Biden administration can do to support the regional de-escalations and to support their bilateral security relationships with all of the partners that they have in the region, to build greater confidence and to support de-escalation for broader regional security.
Great, thanks, Sanam. And we look forward to reading that paper to see your analysis. I know it's been 2+ years since those accords, and many people are examining the implications of it, and look forward to that analysis. Finally, I want to turn, and I know we're going to run a little bit over, but Alex, circle back to you on this question of U.S. policy, and in particular, what this agreement means for something you and I have been discussing with other colleagues in various groups, of the notion of whether there's a plan B for U.S. policy on Iran, since plan A so far hasn't worked out. Does this open up any pathways for any new attempts to resolve the nuclear issue? And then, one of the questions we got in the chat was, how can this agreement brokered by China be sustained if, in the view of this one audience member, if the regime in Iran does not fundamentally change its overall foreign policy approach and make structural changes internally? Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Brian. No, let me take the question from the audience first. That was something I mentioned. Again, this is a pivotal moment for the Islamic Republic. They can make a judgment call in terms of what's best in their view going forward. Clearly, the Iranian public has had enough with what Iran has done in the region has turned out to be extremely costly for very little benefit, tangible benefit, for the immediate concerns of Iranian citizens. So that's a decision that Ayatollah Khamenei has to make. Before I turn to the issue of Plan B or C when it comes to U.S.-Iran, let me just make a remark on what I think, Brian, the U.S. needs to do overall towards the region. And it's to do a better job in terms of reassuring existing partners, in terms of the messaging, the reassurance, and actually think about creative ways of competing with the Chinese, where the Chinese are selling themselves most strongly right now to the region, which is as an economic partner. When you look at things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which was launched 10 years ago, again, people who are interested can look up the numbers. The last study I looked at was China has spent about $950 billion in the last 10 years in infrastructure projects around the world, including Middle East, places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, focused on things like not just energy, but also infrastructure development. The United States is not competing on that front. And if the Middle East is looking at its future in terms of economic development and de-escalation across the board, the U.S. needs to be able to play and have a message in that field. And I'm not sure right now we are, because we're still so much focused on military-to-military ties and the security, which ironically China can do, but yet it's not enough for the United States. So it seems to me like the United States right now, it has become the minimum insurance premium the Gulf states have, but they're looking for the maximum somewhere else. And that isn't necessarily a good thing for the United States. So that was on that point. In terms of the US-Iran relations, look, that's the toughest one. China didn't have to make a decision whether to talk to the Iranian regime or not. They have access. They're the largest trading partner of Iran and so forth. The policymaking community in Washington have to make a decision at this point with about 500 Iranian protesters dead in the last 6 months, whether it is the Islamic Republic of Iran, given the nature of the regime, is worth investing in terms of a dialogue, or to support the opposition to the regime, which is a big if. I don't think for a second the United States really has thought about it, or and I'm not saying it couldn't do it, but I don't think it's made a decision. And if you don't make that decision in terms of where you want to go with Iran, then where are you? You're in limbo. You are where you are right now. You don't talk to them, but you don't really do anything to them either. And that's exactly one of the reasons why the likes of Saudi Arabia went to Iran in the first place, because they were tired of waiting in that gray space. What will the United States do? They invested so much in the Trump administration. The maximum pressure campaign was supposed to be the one thing that delivered change in Iranian behavior. Didn't happen. The U.S. didn't push through. Yes, we had, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani got all the headlines, but it wasn't enough. It does not translate to a systematic U.S. approach to the issue of Iran. So I think that's the key challenge for the United States, because that's the one thing the Chinese have. They can talk to everybody in the Middle East, including a pretty powerful player like Iran. And the United States right now doesn't have that option, and that's going to limit it. So on that note, let me stop, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And thanks to all the panelists for sharing their thoughts, and for the audience for joining us here and sending us really smart questions that we didn't allot ourselves enough time to get to. And I think one of my first conclusions of this panel is that perhaps we here at the Middle East Institute need to go beyond 60 minutes, get a little crazy, maybe go to 75 minutes or maybe even 90 minutes. Wow. Because there's a lot of really rich questions and comments, and it's hard to summarize such a rich discussion briefly. But I think if there's some consensus points, it's that, this deal that China brokered and announced on March 10th may create some hopeful signs for de-escalation, a trend that's been ongoing in parts of the region and on different axes. We here at the Middle East Institute also just concluded some work with the Swiss Foreign Ministry looking at opportunities for de-escalation, and that report will be forthcoming soon. I think there's some questions about the depth of how much this agreement itself will reach into the various tough challenges the Middle East is facing and the people of the Middle East are facing. But some hope, as Rhonda mentioned, about the sort of the golden ring of trying to get to a more sustainable regional security architecture that actually tries to end conflicts truly and with meaning. And Sanam, your strategic overview and your opening comments were very, very rich. And I think the additional insights on the Abraham Accords and how all of this pieces in together into the potential for long-term conflict de-escalation and resolution. And I think the last thing, and it still is an open question, and we should be debating it, is the role of the U.S. in all of this. Clear to me, in my view, is that when the U.S. is not as deeply engaged, when we're, say, pulling back, it does send signals to other actors to step in various ways. And it has potentially some opportunities there in that, but also some costs and some risks in all of this. So I just want to conclude and thank everyone, the panelists and everyone in the audience, for joining us and for hanging on for a couple extra minutes. Really great discussion. For those of you who only saw the last part of this, the full video will be online at mei.edu.